Hey everybody, this is Brian Aiello, and this is Mirage, Speculating on Speculative Fiction. Today we're going to be talking about Robert Heinlein. Joining me is science fiction author Matthew Bin. What was the name of your novel again?
Brandon's Way.
Brandon's Way. How's it doing?
I was doing quite well. I mean, it's a small publisher, but the publisher said that it's their success story for this year. It's sold really well, and well enough that the publisher's he's going to publish my next novel, Sight Unseen. He's given me the deal for that one. So
fantastic.
Everyone's happy.
Written, done,
I'm sorry?
Edited, your next novel?
No, I talked to him earlier this year, and I said, yeah, I was working on one, and he said, well, finish up for the end of the year. So now I'm scrambling to finish a book. I've got about 30,000 words yet to put in it.
Wow.
And then maybe a little editing, who knows?
30,000 words yet to put into what have you written so far?
I'm sorry?
What have you written so far?
Well, I'm about 2/3 of the way through it.
Do I sound okay to you? I'm not roboting or anything, am I?
No.
No, okay. Wow, so that's good. I'm stuck in a novel right now. It's about 60,000 that doesn't seem like it's ever going to get done. In fact, I just pulled a whole character arc out that I think I'm going to make into its own novel. So it's like I'm writing a novel into a novel. I can't understand, being pushed into a novel by the end of the year by an editor. That's incredible. Congratulations, man. That's got to feel wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
So
and scary.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, that's great, though. I mean, you've already had success. That's got to feel good going into a second novel with that same kind of mentality, though.
For sure.
So we're talking about Robert Heinlein, and you suggested him as an author to discuss on this Mirage. How has he come into play with your fiction as a
Well, the reason that I started thinking of him, and I was kind of going back to him a little bit when we first chatted. I guess that was in the summer, and the reason I was going back to him was that at my book launch, the publisher said to me, or said actually in introducing me at the book launch, that he felt that I was a Robert Heinlein with a 21st century sensibility.
Okay.
And which is high praise indeed for me, because I've never discussed Heinlein with my publisher, but it surprised me to hear that, and it was quite complimentary, I felt anyway. But the reason I was so gratified is that Heinlein was somebody that I read a lot of when I was in my teens.
Okay.
And when I was, you were saying how he's one of these older science fiction writers, and it's true that his really well-known books were all in the late 50s, early 60s.
Mm-hmm. He was writing in more of a soft science fiction style too, where he was writing more about the people than the technology, right? I mean, he was writing more about society.
Mm-hmm. And how you saw society evolving.
Are you writing more about the people in your worlds?
I would say so, yeah.
And it's a Heinlein type technique.
Yeah. But the thing is, when I was reading him in high school in the 80s, he was writing, he was still writing. I think he died in 88 or 89.
88.
But I was reading the books that he had published in the mid 80s, which were all showing up in our school library. And the reason I was first introduced to him is my best friend had found him, and these were very sexually explicit in some places.
Interesting.
So as teenagers, we were, let's say, gravitated towards that a little bit. But I think it probably did a lot to influence me as a science fiction writer and as a writer in general, as a lot of things do when you're in those very
yeah, he was sexually liberated, wasn't he? He wrote a lot. He was a nudist. He liked nudity and sex. I mean, he had married been like 3 times and was all over the place as far as his sexuality was concerned, I think.
Right. And he was also very much part of that free love movement in the 60s. He was very much a proponent of that.
And that showed up in his novels.
Yeah.
His future was, what was his future like in his work?
Well, I think and again, this is kind of similar to the rails that my train runs on. He sort of saw, technology and the quickening pace of society and more interconnectedness with society. Uh, um, faster travel, better data, that kind of thing. Even in the 80s, he was definitely seeing this, but he also saw. I think what he was seeing was, so these were going to give opportunities for societal reform, maybe change, maybe reform, maybe improvement. I'm not sure exactly what word you use on that, but often he would be in his novels showing these sort of experimental configurations of society. One novel that I remember very well reading when I was in high school, and that I went back to not long ago and kind of gave it another look, is called Friday, and it's about artificial persons and at what point somebody becomes human, which is not a unique thought in science fiction writing, of course, but one of the items in the novel is that the main character joins a family, and the family is somewhat a collection of people who choose to be together, and there's sort of a polyamory sort of vibe to it. But it's also kind of corporate. They're all shareholders in the family, and yeah, it's kind of like a hippie commune with strong, fiscal oversight.
So they're not blood related.
No, not blood related, or not in all
Even the
cases.
same species or makeup. They're what kind of makeup are they?
Yeah. Well, it was I think it was 3 women and 3 men, and
Are they of the same species?
I'm sorry.
Oh, they have the same species.
Oh yes, yeah. In this case, Heinlein was not going sort of off-world at all. It was very
he's
human.
always on Earth.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, it's just kind of and I think he did a lot of this sort of thinking through how he would reform issue or constructs like the family, which I guess is what we're trying to do as science fiction artists, is to think about how society could change.
Yeah, it's absolutely true, isn't it? How we relate to each other as human beings, how we relate as human beings to society, and how we relate as society to the planet or the ecosystem itself, right?
Yeah, and actually there's a quote from Heinlein, and I kind of had it set aside for you because I thought this might be of interest. For those of us writing science fiction, Heinlein said, "I think that science fiction, even the corniest of it, even the most outlandish of it, no matter how badly it's written, has a distinct therapeutic value because all of it has as its primary postulate that the world does change." I cannot overemphasize the importance of that idea. I think that's where Heinlein. I think this is what I kind of realize as a science fiction author as well, is we have to look forward to we're not satisfied with how things are, and we're looking forward to change, whether for better, for worse, or figure out how it works or whatever. But it's about change, making the world change, and if we have that kind of faith in the world and in people, that's what makes us look to science fiction. I think.
This right now, it seems like the trend is dystopian, isn't it? Though the trend in science fiction
is
dystopian. You're not writing dystopian fiction, though, are you? You're writing more happy fiction, not utopian. I don't think.
I wouldn't necessarily say that, because I do take a fairly cynical view of. I have a cynical view of how things are, and I have a cynical view of how they'll go forward. That my starting point often is we're making a lot of changes. There are a lot of opportunities with technology, but the basic human dynamics about strengthening power for the people in power and amassing riches for the people with the riches, those stay constant. And I worry
people that don't have the power and don't have the riches remain disenfranchised and poor.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I don't want to sound like a Marxist revolutionary here. That's not the idea at all. But I do.
What I've read recently is that when you're writing science fiction, you're not reinventing the wheel. What you're doing is kind of describing the world in which you live, magnified looking forward. And
Yeah.
right, I mean, when we're discussing Heinlein, you're discussing the 1950s and early 60s, and that was kind of a utopian environment, right? Was he writing a more
Yeah.
utopian type of future?
I wouldn't. I think he was writing he was trying to write a very realistic future. So I would say there's some positive elements and some negative, but I guess what I would look at is the side. You're right that we're basically only writing about ourselves and where we live. I had a literature prof who said no writer writes about anything but his own street, and I think there's some value in that.
Yeah.
But I think if you're in the post-war boom like Heinlein was, when there was nothing but opportunity for Americans and for the Western world, and despite the specter of nuclear annihilation, everybody was getting richer, getting happier, getting more opportunities, more stuff, being able to travel, getting cars, all the positives of
and the
that 50s
horizon
and
was
60s period.
connected to you by a black stretch of perfectly brand new asphalt. You know what I mean? You could get in your car and just cruise at 55 miles an hour, just go to the next rest stop and pull off and eat McDonald's, and just camp at a brand new hotel that had no fleas or bed bugs. I mean, it's just a beautiful, beautiful world that they lived in at that point. God, can you imagine?
It is, and
well,
I'm sorry?
Free love. Was it free love? I mean, the environment of the hippies.
Well, yeah, and I think it was maybe a reaction to that increasingly mechanized, increasingly fast-paced. But I think that someone like Heinlein was also, or I think writers like Heinlein who are in a period that has a certain tone, they're going to write the other side of it. So in the 50s and in maybe people who grew up in the 90s, where we had lost that dread of nuclear war, where we had the economy starting to boom, technology was starting to really come into people's lives, it's natural that those people, I think, would turn to dystopian fiction as a way to sort of pull apart what they're living in and make sense of it. Right.
You also had the idea of giving back, though, too. The advent of the Peace Corps in the early 60s with JFK's kind of saying, give back. There was the draft on where young men were asked to join the military. And Heinlein was kind of one of those writers who were saying, if you want to be a part of society, you need to give part of your life to society. And one of my favorite movies,
that was Starship Troopers.
And that was one of his more famous, I don't know if that's one of his more famous books. One of the things I was reading is that, the director of Starship Troopers could not read Starship Troopers. He could not get past chapter 2 or 3. He said it was the most boring thing he ever read in his life. And he was lauded, celebrated for the movie that he made. I mean, it's a cult classic, right? But the purists, the Heinlein purists, hated the movie because it came nowhere close to the vision that Heinlein wrote about.
It's very true. And I think it's kind of like Paul Verhoeven took the basic idea of...
Very good. I was not going to come close to pronouncing that dude's name. So, congratulations.
Thank you. But I think he took some little points from there and made the movie he wanted to make, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I saw Starship Troopers in the theaters. I was I don't want to say a huge fan of it, but I was impressed with it.
I was impressed.
But I've actually never read the novel myself.
He did a great job. I mean, I thought the characters were very well done.
Yeah. I mean, there's some corniness to that one too, but it's all good. But it's
something they weren't able to duplicate either. They tried to make sequels to it, and they were not able to capture that same feeling for some reason.
No. But you're also, like, when you're making a movie based on a book that was written 40, 45 years before, it's a little difficult. It's hard to take those ideas that the book was kicking around and apply them 2 generations later. So I think the 1997 movie is about 1997, right?
Yeah, I guess because as we stated earlier, you're writing about the streets you live on. And that was also taken kind of a segment of the book, right? I mean, it wasn't like the whole book. It was a chapter, a portion, a small paragraph of the book. The book itself is about a bigger... It's not about the dogs. It's about something else. right?
Well, it's really about, what do we deserve, or how do we deserve citizenship? How do we deserve a say in things? And I think he was looking back to the Roman ideas of citizenship. But I don't know. Like I say, it's maybe not. There's some science fiction that is very grounded in its time, and some that's a little more universal. And I think we take the aspects that we need from it.
Heinlein loved to moralize like that too, didn't he? I mean, his fiction was kind of really, especially the early stuff. I mean, he would just like rant, moralize for page on page on page, endlessly. He has novels
that wasn't
screed.
That wasn't just the early stuff.
Oh, really?
he often would find opportunities in any of his books. I mean, you kind of see this in other ones. Orson Scott Card, I can remember in Ender's Game, there's some segments like this. But Heinlein, it's really remarkable how much he shoehorned in his lectures into his books.
I didn't notice that in Ender's Game. Ender's Game is probably one of my favorite science fiction books.
And I like Ender's Game. I'm kind of thinking of some of those passages where they're talking about, what the brother is doing and why, right? And how, or the brother and sister, and how they're doing things. And there's sort of ideas about how society works, or how people are swayed, that that are kind of just talked about rather than shown. And again, it's a valid technique for an author to use. It's just, it was remarkable how much Heinlein did use it. Like, let's put them in a classroom and we'll have the lecturer lecture them, or let's have two people discuss how this family thing works because they're not agreeing on something, right?
Yeah.
And so they'd have a whole explication of this societal experiment that he's performing in his little book, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess the ultimate thing here, though, with Heinlein is he's not considered a forgotten author. He was celebrated. He was awarded.
Yes.
I mean, he's up there with Isaac Asimov. I mean, he's up there with the greats of his time. He's not a forgotten person. He's not just a hidden wonder. He's a celebrated author. And during his time, even though if you look through his credits, very few of them were made in the films, he wrote very few novels, in fact. What was he, 39 published short fiction pieces. I mean, he's not very prolific in terms of what he actually put out into the world, but he is incredibly celebrated in terms of what he actually did, right?
Yes. Yeah, and he was writing in the golden age, right? And
I mean, the perfect time to be Robert Heinlein was when Robert Heinlein was being Robert Heinlein.
Yeah.
I mean, if we can go back in time and write at that same portion, could we be one of those people? That's the main question. Could we be
right? But I think I'm thinking more of his reputation. That he gained a certain reputation, and you can't take the person out of the time or the time out of the person, right? They're both there's too much interplay. You can't sort of separate who they were and where and when they were. But I think that his reputation was built on some novels early on in his career that put him on that pinnacle with the greatest of the science fiction writers I mean, I think Stranger in a Strange Land was the first science fiction novel, and this is 1961, it was the first science fiction novel ever to be on the New York Times bestseller list. So he was current in society, not just in science fiction.
He did. He crossed that line, didn't he? He went from not being published in pulp to being published in literary fashion, basically.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I think he kind of what do I want to say? Kind of he fell out of the public eye and went back to being a science fiction, known to the science fiction world and pretty much no one else. Like, by the time I was reading him in the 80s, he was not getting on any mainstream bestseller lists, right? But I think he was in early enough and was so famous in his time across literary society that he was bound to be on that pinnacle that people like Asimov were on.
He's on that pinnacle, though, isn't he? I mean, wouldn't people say he is? I mean, Asimov obviously belongs on where Asimov is. I mean, he's on the highest, along with Arthur C. Clarke potentially.
Yeah.
If not even potentially even higher.
And I think
than
that's
Arthur C. Clarke.
But I think that's about that's the big three from that period, right?
Heinlein belongs on that same one. On the top three?
Well, he's put on that one. I don't know about. I mean, it's hard to look back to the 50s and say yes, he belonged there, right?
Right,
but I do think
maybe Asimov and then Clarke, and then you put Heinlein up there too, or is it, you could knock off?
Bradbury was more of a student of Heinlein.
Oh,
Bradbury came after. Listen, I love Bradbury much more than Bradbury is one of my gods of fiction. He's definitely one of my big favorites.
Oh, dude,
I would put him as a better writer.
Bradbury died in 2012. I did not know that.
Yeah,
that was just like right yesterday. That's crazy.
Yeah. For me, Bradbury is a much more. I would much rather read a Bradbury novel than a Heinlein novel. I think in most cases. But that doesn't change that Heinlein was, as science fiction was coming into the mainstream and as the space race was actually starting, which the space race didn't start till 1957 in any real way, right?
Yeah.
In that period, Heinlein was right there at the forefront, and
Heinlein's writing about colonizing the moon when the moon wasn't even potentially a target to be landed on. I mean, right? He was being laughed at.
Exactly.
He's being ridiculed for writing a novel about it. Like, dude, come on, give us a break. Write something real. And he's writing speculative fiction. He's writing after what's the guy's name who wrote Tarzan? He's writing about going to Mars. I mean, he's being laughed at, and he's writing fake science fiction stuff, and it's a crazy world that this guy's writing about, and he's being laughed at.
Mm-hmm.
And then 16 years later, we land on the moon. That's what I'm reading about his achievements, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, this guy was way ahead of his time. I mean, Jules,
in a way,
right in the mid 19th century, and he's writing about the same stuff. It's like it's not really outside the realm of possibilities, and this guy's getting ridiculed.
But I mean, that's science fiction, right? It's always been given, it's never been given its literary due. It's always considered sort of writing for children and idiots. And meanwhile, the people who were writing in the 50s, Arthur C. Clarke and Heinlein and Asimov, and many others who were writing all the short stories that were becoming extremely popular at the time, these are the people who had the vision that led to Kennedy saying in 1960 or 61, we're going to go to the moon. Only that period of American history, I think, could have managed that, to put all those resources and all those incredible minds in step to achieve the same vision. There's no way that could happen today. I absolutely don't think that you could recreate that.
I mean, there is a school of thought. What is it called where science fiction has led to scientific breakthroughs? If it wasn't for the fiction that was being written with science in mind, there wouldn't be the type of science that was being thought of. You know what I mean? There's a hand-holding technique. Being done, one washing the other. I mean, do you know what the term I'm looking for here, or is there even a term associated with that?
I don't know if there's a specific term for it, but definitely there's kind of a chicken and egg thing, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things that we forget is that scientists are people too, and they need a vision as well. And it's sort of as we think of what's possible, we start to achieve what's possible, and it's not possible till we kind of conceive of it, right? So I think that's definitely something that we're sort of, the science fiction is the vision that the science can actually achieve. In many cases, sometimes the vision is not possible, but I
was thinking about this today. I'm doing my research, getting ready for the podcast, and I'm wondering, Heinlein is envisioning a future where we colonize the moon, and I'm reading about, these lava tunnels on the moon a few days ago, how that might be possibly where we colonize the moon, where we put our cities of the future or whatever. Where are we writing about tomorrow? What are we putting down in our fiction that's so revolutionary that our audience is going, ha ha ha, look at this idiot? Where's our fiction so unique and so crazy that people are laughing at us. It's so outlandish. I mean, the world is so figured out. The universe is so figured out. Where are we getting our ideas from? Where are we Heinleining the future? Where are we Jules Verning? I almost feel like everything is just kind of figured out, and our fiction's so boring now. Spaceships and laser gun fights and whatever have you.
Well, this is one of the eternally interesting subjects for people is people, and I think that's probably where
Social science fiction. Yeah, you're right. People
Yeah,
are always interesting, right? Where's the character? Where's the people at? What are they doing?
Yeah, and I think that does fit in with technology too. And I think the technology has to be a mover in science fiction. I don't know that science fiction without some technological aspect, but for me, it's the actual science fiction aspect is not, or the technology aspect isn't central, but it's still, I think it has to be there, because that's one of those avenues for societal change. I actually was just listening recently to, I don't know if you're familiar with the Cracked.com podcast, and they had a podcast discussing scientific breakthroughs or near breakthroughs currently that would make great science fiction film plots. And I think that's it was a good sign that there are things happening that we don't have everything figured out, and things can still happen. We can still surprise ourselves as a society.
Like what? Give me a couple examples.
Oh, a great one was a vest that they developed for the hearing impaired. And it has a bunch of, like 130 little vibrating units in it. And they vibrate in different patterns. It's tethered to your cell phone, and they vibrate in different patterns. And so if somebody's calling, because this person is visually impaired, they can't see on the screen who's calling. So there's a certain pattern of these buzzes that tell them this person is calling. So they have to teach the person to recognize the different patterns. So your mom's calling, that's the pattern you're feeling. Your mom's calling, that's the pattern you're feeling. But after a while, but wearing this vest, what people realize is, and this is whether they're visually impaired or not, they don't notice the physical sensation anymore. What they notice is, my mom's calling. They get it's like they're feeling psychic, And the idea that we've got this this capacity in our physiological makeup to be able to meld our physical sensation and a mental impression in that way, and we're finding new ways to do that. I think that's amazing, and I think that's something that I could definitely see a science fiction plot in that. Nobody steal that. That one's mine. Okay.
You know what's so great about science fiction? They say you could tell somebody, you ever play the game where the teacher tells you to draw something, like draw the line straight down and then draw diagonally up to the right and then draw left or something? You're supposed to be drawing a triangle. It's a classroom full of 25 people or something along those lines. And then after you're done writing, drawing all the instructions, the teacher collects your pieces of paper and shows you what everybody has done. And there are 25 different things that people have drawn with the same exact instructions. It doesn't matter what you say verbally, because everybody's going to interpret it a different way. I think it's beautiful how human minds work with the same exact things.
It is.
Like fingerprints. We're so unique at the same exact time.
I think there's two major truths about humanity. One is we're all completely unique, and the second one is we're all exactly the same.
Exactly the same. My liver is on my right side, just like yours is underneath our ribs. But if we both got it accidentally ripped out and placed side by side, mine would look totally different than yours. That's my liver. That's your liver. That's really gross and morbid, but you know what I mean.
But I also think.
Another thing that popped into my head when you were talking about the vest, on Reddit the other day, there was a post about a blind boy and his father that had gone to a football match, football being UK, soccer.
Oh, yes.
Did you see this? And the boy, he's visually impaired, and his father had his hands on a pitch match, a pitch, a copy of the field. And he would take his hands and he would guide him on the action on the field as it was happening. And man, it actually got me like welled up with emotion watching this boy, just like, he's not seeing anything, he's feeling it with his hands, and he's so excited. He's like being able to enjoy what everybody in that crowd is being able to enjoy. So it was so beautiful. It was so wonderful. I don't know if a vest can help him achieve that same kind of excitement, but the interaction between the father and the son, and they can both enjoy this thing that under any other circumstance the boy can't enjoy. It was just beautiful. It was really, really emotive.
Well, I think what that shows us is that we think typically that the way we see the world is the way the world is. And what we don't realize is there's a lot of different ways to experience the world. And that boy is getting an experience that for him is exactly is his analog for what I get, which is sight and sound, the sort of average run-of-the-mill experience of a soccer game.
Which, you'll be doing 5 or 6 different things at the same time, right? You might have your phone in your hand. You might have a beer over here. You might be talking to your wife or your girlfriend or your kids. You could do 8 different things while you're watching that same game. But that kid, he's going to concentrate. He cannot do anything but have his hands on that pitch. That's the only thing he can do. You know what I mean? Yeah. He's got to singularly enjoy that game.
I think of this. I think of this when I have a dog, and my dog's an idiot.
Did you say?
Yes, yeah. He's a wonderful, wonderful animal. I love this guy. We just got him in April.
All dogs are idiots, honestly.
Oh yeah,
that's why we love them.
Thing. But one of the challenges, we just got this guy. He's a rescue. We got him in April, and one of the things that's really tough is figuring out how he thinks, so that I can, sort of convince him, that something isn't scary. For example, the new stairs that we've got in our back to our back door are not scary. He's allowed to use them. It's all good, right? And I think about this as, dogs have a certain way of seeing the world. And they're not idiots. They act like we would act if we were idiots, but they're a lot smarter than we give them credit for, I think. But they have a certain way of seeing the world too. And one of the things that science fiction allows is for us to look at our own world, that thing that we're very complacent about, so complacent that we've got 6 other things going on when we're watching a soccer game, that we can think about what it would look like to somebody on the outside, and that what are the fresh eyes that we have to look at it, and whether that's by comparing us with an alien, a non-Earth race, whether that's making some massive change to society and seeing how it affects it, which would be let's say a dystopian future or something else. These are or the introduction of a new technology that radically changes society. All these things are the possibilities that we play with in science fiction, and I think this is what we're in the game for, is to figure these things out. So that's why that vest story, just going back to that's why that story, that new way of perceiving the world, that new way of thought entering our heads is so fascinating.
To spin this back around to Robert Heinlein and the idea, and this is what I have been wrestling with for a little while now, because I do find myself writing a lot of dystopian fiction. I want to get away from the idea of the world is ending. Oh my God, humanity is going to die. I want to write more positive stuff because I feel like humanity wants to read positive stuff. I want a happy ending, not a, oh, my head's been chopped off. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think science fiction. Sorry.
No, please.
Well, for me, science fiction is about hope, and I admit I have a cynical view of the world, but I also have hope that we can change it, and that's why I'm a science fiction author as well. That's why any literary work is an act of ungodly ego and optimism, but I think hope is at the center of it for me, and I agree with you that hopeful science fiction is something that we desperately need.
Does Robert Heinlein write with hope?
I think so. I think he was looking at science fiction as a way to try out these possibilities for improvement in society, that we were sitting here in these centuries-old constructs, and really we had the opportunities were coming to kick down the door or burn down the house and build a new one, a better one. And I think he's very much in that mode.
It's very interesting that you say centuries old, because I think when he was writing, we were only decades into this new ideal. we were, two world wars into a century that was brand spanking new. And now we're
Well,
almost 2 decades into a new millennium where, God, we're making the rules up as we go along. We have this.
well, yes. But Heinlein was interested in much more constructs or ideas like the family and organized religion, which I think it was people like him asking those questions that helped to break down that sort of homogeneous idea of what a family should look like. I
Yes,
think
and
now, for the first time,
I would
maybe
agree
ever,
with that too, because when Heinlein was writing, organized religion was starting to die too.
Mhm.
The idea of going to church and praying to a god started to seem a little ridiculous because we had started to expand beyond the sphere called Earth. We started to look
Yeah.
beyond. Heaven wasn't in the clouds anymore. Heaven wasn't the moon. Heaven wasn't the sun. Heaven was not, where's heaven? You know what I mean? I'm reading Endurance, the Scott Kelly book. My God, it's really good. If you haven't picked it up yet, highly recommend it. It's really, really interesting. I love these astronaut biographies or autobiographies. They're just really, they give you a nice perspective on what it takes to be superhuman. And man, these astronauts really are superhuman. And he talks about how he was a kid in New Jersey and he had that moment where his parents said, "My God, you want to go to church? If you don't, then we don't have to go to church anymore." And it was kind of like, okay, fine, we don't have to go to church. And that's basically what kids now are like. It's like, why go to church?
Well, and I think we've had a century of, starting from World War I, of radical change in our society. And I would say that, the science fiction authors probably helped to accelerate it just by giving us the ideas as a society that things can change, the things that we take for granted, good or bad, we don't have to. We can imagine a different world. And I agree with you that the dystopian future is not the world that I want to imagine. I want a better world, and I think most of us do.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that we come from these dystopian pasts either. We look at pictures of World War I or World War II, and we see these horrible, mass deaths. The carnage of what is it, the Somme or the Holocaust, the ovens, the mounds of shoes from the German death camps or whatnot. We don't want those repeated, so we make rules, we make laws, we try to prevent things like that from happening. Genital mutilation in African countries or whatever, we constantly are striving to make humans better. And what happens? You know what I mean? We push ourselves to be better and better and better. Social science fiction is happening in the attempt every single day to push human beings into being better creatures.
Absolutely.
But I mean, I don't know. He's post World War II, right? He's a former Navy officer who has weird ailments. He's got tuberculosis. He's got weird blood things happening. I mean, you said you discovered him in the mid 80s. He's post surgery. He's dying. He doesn't have much longer to live. He sees the end of his life. What are those novels like that you discovered in high school? Those last few?
I think these were very much more his social science fiction. I think he was, because I did read Stranger in a Strange Land at that period, but I was also reading Friday and The Cat That Walked Through Walls. And those ones I think were more those idea fiction rather than and social constructs and that kind of thing, with a futuristic bent, with there was plenty of sciencey cool in these things, right? And I think he was trying to see how things like the advent of data collection was starting to affect the world in the 80s. And I mean, it was kindergarten for data compared to where we are now,
right?
But it was the kind of stuff he was playing with. I think they're still interesting. I just don't. I find it a little bit. I guess my political views have diverged with his sort of libertarian views by this point. I'm definitely not a libertarian, and so I find it a little bit tedious going through his philosophical side and his lectures.
What I find interesting is he's one of the top three, but his work is not transferred over to film very well at all.
Yeah.
What is it? There was one piece that made it to Star Trek, the Rolling Rocks or something like that, and it was accidental. It was the Trouble with Tribbles episode. The author thought that he had plagiarized it, and he reached out to Heinlein, and Heinlein said, "Nah, don't worry about it. Just send me a signed copy of the script or whatever." But that was basically it. I mean, with Starship Troopers and a few of the other ones, I mean, he does not translate it very well to television or film. Even directors have said, "Oh, I can't read this guy's work." I mean, Asimov too is kind of like that as well.
He's kind of unfilmable, Heinlein. And I kind of understand why Starship Troopers would be the one that they would pick as a source material, because there's actual fighting in it. You know, it's a military sci-fi novel. But I don't know. I mean, then again, you can look at Arthur C. Clarke's work.
Yeah, no, that's we nowadays, I saw Blade Runner 2049, and that's like one of those movies where you just kind of sit back and let the visuals kind of wash over you. You know, the synth soundtrack and whatnot, and the movie's like 3 hours long, and there's some action, but not a lot. You know, that's not why you go, and I ended up paying for the 3D because, you know, you go to an early movie hoping to pay for a cheap movie ticket, and instead they make you pay for 3D.
Yeah.
It's like, there's good visuals, but why are you making me pay for 3D? This is why I don't go to the movie theaters. But anyway, it'd be nice to go to a movie that just washes over you. That's not all loud music and loud fighting scenes and, you know, screaming and guns and whatever. I would love to see something that just is there. That's beautiful. I would think that they would invest in something like this.
Well, that's what Arthur C. Clarke and it was
2001, right?
Yeah, Kubrick. That's what they were achieving there, I think, with that movie. I don't know if anybody's making that today, though.
Right. It's so difficult, the last third of 2001 to sit through.
Yeah.
It's so hard. And thank God I did. I mean, it's a wonderful ending to get into the bedroom and to watch that guy die and to experience that moment with that character. But Arthur C. Clarke is another one. I mean, what other movies have been actually made with his work? I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, I don't actually. That's a good point. I'm not sure that they have. I mean, they made 2010.
Well, that 2010 got they got laughed out of the theaters, right?
I wasn't. I personally, I was a kid when that came out. I kind of liked the movie.
I like the fact
was cool with it.
Dolphin in the pool.
Yes.
That was my favorite. I was really young. I think you're a little bit older than me.
Yeah.
Right? I think so. I'm 41.
I'm 44.
Yeah, a little tiny bit older than me, so maybe you would have appreciated that movie a slightly bit more than I did. But seriously, when I saw that dolphin in the pool, I wanted a dolphin in a pool badly, and I would watch that movie over and over again just for the dolphin in the pool. And the fact they ate dinner next to the pool with the dolphin in it, I was all about that movie. But they made that one, and then Asimov, they made a few off of his movies. One of them was a gigantic action extravaganza with Will Smith.
Yes.
And Bicentennial Man, which is probably one of my favorite films with Robin Williams.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember any other ones.
But I mean, I don't know if you could do Foundation. I would love to see a great Foundation movie, but I don't know if it's possible. Yeah.
There's thousands of years that take place in those novels, right?
Yeah. And all the action is always off screen, right? It's always finding out the effect of the action. You never see the revolutions and the takeovers and the invasions in the novel, you know. So it would be an interesting challenge for sure.
There's a short attention span in today's market.
Definitely.
I mean,
and I'm as guilty as anyone.
Turning our eye to your novels. I mean, how do you handle your plot? Do you do it in the way of action? close attention to detail while you're spinning your plot from beginning to end, or are you doing it in the way of Heinlein, where you do your social narrative, your social science fiction in a grander scheme while you're trying to regale your readers with ideas for the future?
Well, I think there is one scene in Brendan's Way where there's a discussion of sort of the political stuff, and knowing that I was discussing that stuff, I didn't want to make it into a lecture. I made it into an argument where one character is getting a different view of the world that he hasn't seen before and is kind of resisting it. I try to have a bias towards action, and I do recognize that as readers.
You come from the school of show versus tell.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I think there's certain stylistic things that I didn't realize I had picked up from Heinlein that I did, or maybe from others in that time or something. But I think, I was reading a bit of Heinlein recently, and he does this thing where he gives these offhand details of stuff that had happened but of course, that was, that city was lost in the war of, in 2012 in the war, whatever war, and they just kind of gloss over these things as though everybody knows what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to give you any details. And that's how I build backstory in my books, is by just sort of building up this set of references to, what I see as the near future, and there's just sort of I felt like I was reading my own stuff, and I don't want to compliment myself too much and say, oh yeah, I'm writing like a master. But I recognize that my technique of doing that was probably heavily influenced by Heinlein.
Well, that's not a bad thing necessarily.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I mean, I've also learned a little bit about this novel thing over the years, and I've written a few. So, I do try to sort of, I have a sense for how a chapter needs to end to make the reader read the next one, that kind of thing. And that helps as well in terms of like that short attention span. I'm building a novel to sort of influence the reader to keep going. But that's part of the skill.
You could do what I'm doing, which is decide that your character's arc needs to continuously start over again, closer to the beginning of his life, endlessly until you make him born, and then maybe you need to start farther back at the gestation period, and then maybe farther back with his parents rutting in some kind of sweaty opulence, and then maybe farther back at the beginning of his genetic line at some kind of primordial ooze where there's some kind of sponge thing sliding out of it. I don't know. I just can't stop writing the beginning of my fucking novel, and I wish I could stop.
So I can see why you're not getting finished just yet.
I haven't figured out where the hell the start is. Like, wait, is 200,000 words enough? Am I almost done?
Cut it back by 10%, send it out.
Oh man, so how do we sum up Robert Heinlein? If Robert Heinlein was writing in today's market, how do you think he would do?
I think he would have to change to suit the market a little bit, but that's true of anybody who's writing from the 50s. I think he had some interesting ideas, and I think his bias towards pulling apart society and figuring out how he could do it differently, I think would be of great interest still. Because we're still hanging on to very old ideas about how things are supposed to work, and I think a voice like his, I would be interested in reading how he would read our current society. If there is another Heinlein out there, I'm not sure who it is right now, but I would love to find out who, because I'd definitely be interested.
Well, I mean, let's say there is a Robert Heinlein out there right now. What are they writing about? I mean, who are they? Let's take them now. What would a Robert Heinlein? He's middle of his career, 1950s, so he's writing novels currently. So he's a war vet, right?
No, he was actually between the wars. He was in the 20s and 30s. He was in the Navy.
So he's our kind of vet then. He was born, he was serving in the Navy in the 90s. He's an officer, He was sick, so he got out. 6 years, so he has nothing. He has VA care. Or is he Canadian? No, he's an American.
He's American.
He's an American. He's probably what's he doing for a living while he's writing? And
I don't recall. I think he might have been writing for a living pretty early on.
He was writing for a living. He had a bunch of different jobs. He was silver mining.
Right.
Oddly enough. And like I looked this up. He was silver mining. He had real estate license. He was selling real estate in California. Um, he married some woman who went crazy, so he divorced her. He walked away from her, said, "You're crazy, lady. You're manic depressive. I'm divorcing you." And he married some other one and walked away from her too. I think the third one he married, he liked her. She was smart. He tried to go to graduate school for mathematics and physics. He dropped out immediately. So he's not faring very well. He graduated 20th in his class from Annapolis. It's really good, right? Out of 250 people.
Yeah.
6-year Navy career. So, I mean, what is he doing right now? Does he have a job? Is he unhappy? Is he doing customer service for AT&T?
I don't know.
Is he
That's a
waiting
good question.
tables? Waiting tables. Waiting tables at a Shoney's. Was a writing at night, miserable. No, he goes on a mass murder spree.
Well, let's hope not. But you know, one author that came to mind as somebody who's doing similar things in terms of the social science fiction is his name's Robert Charles Wilson. He's a Canadian science fiction writer, and he had a book a couple of years ago called Affinities. And his idea was that given the data and given our ability to understand people through data now, we should be able to build tribes of people who would get along and have very similar values, very similar outlook on the world. And that's how we should find our friends, not through random chance. And so he kind of, it's a little bit dystopian, but it's also kind of dealing with ideas like big data. But the idea that, you know, our friends and the people that we hang around with, the people we choose to spend our time with, they should be people that we actually can identify as the right people to do that with. So that book kind of seems like a Heinlein. It's not Heinlein in sensibility, but it certainly seems like the kind of idea that Heinlein would have understood and gotten cool with, you know, gotten interested in.
Okay. Well, as you were talking, I had an idea. What about Dave Eggers?
Hmm.
Do you know who he is?
Yeah.
He does not get mentioned too much in terms of speculative fiction, but I think he's writing in speculative fiction on the down low. He wrote Hologram for the King, and he wrote another book called The Circle. And both of those books are fantastic. I picked them up and I could not put them down again. One of them is about a guy who goes to Saudi Arabia and is basically waiting for the king of Saudi Arabia to show up so he can sell him this hologram technology. In my mind, hologram technology is future tech. But I think there actually is hologram technology out there. But this hologram tech is kind of like, you know, telecommunication stuff where you can talk to somebody from far away and they show up in a hologram form. I don't know if that stuff is out there. So it sounds like 10 or 20 years away from now, which means speculative fiction. The Circle is kind of like Google or like whatever have you. And basically it just wraps the entire world up into this social network. And it's kind of it's crazy. So it's all social science fiction in a way.
Interesting. Yeah, it does sound like a similar kind of thrust, and I think there's room for that in science fiction. I know a lot of people are into the spaceships and lasers and stuff, but to me, I guess I probably my bias is more towards these guys, and I wish I was smart enough to sort of distill society in those ways, like these, like Dave Eggers and Robert Charles Wilson are doing. But
I'm gonna have to check out Charles Wilson. I like that stuff. I like social science fiction. I hate lasers and stuff. I hate stuff so much. I would rather stay away from it. I really do.
Yeah.
I mean, the story that I am working on right now is about a vet in a war in the future, but it is more about him trying to find his place in a society that has a major, you know, but a major line through the middle of it between those who have nothing and those that are trying to keep everything they have away from those who have nothing.
Right.
And those that are trying to escape. So I don't know if that's social science fiction or not, but this has been a great conversation in terms of trying to, you know, define science fiction in the modern society and what has been written in the past, which is basically, you know, the foundation of what we're trying to write now.
Yeah.
Would you like to add anything else about Robert Heinlein, the sixth generation German American? You know, his family fought in every single American war from the Revolutionary War on up till
Wow, I didn't catch that.
World War II. He actually would have fought in World War II if he hadn't have been diagnosed with pulmonary tuberculosis.
Yeah, wow. I don't know what else to say about him, but I do think that he's not just somebody we should just relegate to the the dustbin of history, as they say. I think he is worth a look, maybe with shorter works or something, but I think there's still something we can learn from him.
I don't know where he's going, unfortunately. I don't think many people are talking about him in terms of...
No, they're not.
I mean, you've mentioned him, and a few other people that I've talked to on my podcast have mentioned him. But I have not read a single work of his. And the only way I know him is through Starship Troopers. And that's kind of been, now it's being laughed at because of all the dumb sequels off of the great movie that's been made.
Right.
It's unfortunate. I wish,
well,
and I look him up and I see, the covers of his novels are 1950s pulp. They don't seem to be of quality, unfortunately. Stranger in a Strange Land sounds like a great novel, and I should read it.
Yeah, that's one of the ones I think that... I think Stranger in a Strange Land is probably a good place for most people to start today. I think it still has some currency.
Can you count Trouble with Tribbles as a Robert Heinlein story?
I think that's cheating. I think you're trying to cheat it there.
I don't know. I mean, is this something I should make my son read when he gets a little bit older? So you got to read this book so that at least it carries on through him.
Well,
I feel like my list of books is so long.
Parental content advisory for giving that to your son.
Is it that bad?
All of his books, I think, have components of that sort of free love ideal that Heinlein was into. So,
but is it 1960s bad, or is it like internet present day bad?
No, it's nothing could come close from the 60s to internet present day. So
I mean, my son in high school is going to have access to the worst of the worst, and nothing I can give him from the 1950s compare.
Probably, yeah, you're probably right.
You forget. I think he'll have access to the worst of the worst before I'm even aware that he can do it. That boy, he knows what the mouse does right now. And I'm worried that he's going to discover stuff that I'm so worried. I don't know how to keep it from him. I'm not going to be able to, unfortunately. I know I'm not going to be able to.
Yeah.
All right, man. Thank you so much for joining me today on our discussion about Robert Heinlein. You're welcome back anytime you want. If you want to discuss the other two greats, Isaac Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke, you're more than welcome to. Just drop me a line and we'll set up a date.
That'd be great.
All right, man. Good luck with your 30,000 words. I'm sure you will capture them.
Thanks very much. I need the luck, that's for sure.
No, not luck, dude. Just the time to do it.
Yeah. All right, take care. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, man. Bye-bye.